Greetings and welcome back to room 303, and we are now in our talks with Walt. We are now turning to the epigraph, as it sometimes is referred to, or Come Said My Soul, with, we should point out, the signature specifically of Walt Whitman on the title page. Now we're going to get to the history of this in a moment, but let's just begin really quickly by reviewing our assumptions. Again, I hope that you've already been paying attention to our LearnStrong.net site, and there you will find previous lectures. And of course, we try to remind ourselves in room 303 that we are the stories we tell, the stories we retell. We're also the stories we decide to accept or reject, and certainly, of course, with Whitman, that's a huge element in our study. We want to remind you about our assumptions regarding learning theory and our desire to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways, or as we sometimes say it, the new is the new, the NEW is the KNEW. We also assume that you are familiar with our annotation approach, our level 1, when we ask about summary of a text, level 2, themes, messages, level 2B, rhetoric, literary techniques that Walt Whitman will be using. At 3I, we'll try to relate to other texts, and finally at 3B, the ultimate goal, right? Relate to oneself. We're also assuming that you're familiar with what we call our Big Five. That is to say, what does the text that we're specifically looking at have to say about epistemology, what you can know, ontology, who we are, psychology, the individual mind, sociology, the study of collective minds, and then finally, and it seems to me for Whitman especially, the fifth of our Big Five, the theodicy question. Why does pain and suffering have to happen? Whitman saw his share of it. He was a part of a whole lot of it, of course, living through the terrible Civil War of 4 years. And again, for Whitman, the goal is always to ask not why did this happen to me, but rather why did this happen for me? We'll see that in so many of our studies. Finally, the assumption is that you're familiar with our 5 Ps, as we call it, perspectives on Whitman. Whitman as person, Whitman as poet, Whitman as pedagogue, Whitman as politician, and finally Whitman as philosopher. Now our goal here, of course, is to try to address as much of this as we can in each one of our lectures. We are, of course, at the very beginning of our series of comments on Leaves of Grass in each of those poems. Let's turn now specifically to this poem. Epigraph, as it's sometimes referred to, first printed in the Christmas number of the New York Daily Graphic, December 1874. So think about that. 1855 is when Leaves of Grass is first published. So this was not a part of that one, and then it became a part of it, right? Then it became published in the New York Tribune in February 19th, 1876. Signed by Walt Whitman, it became the title page or the epigraph of Leaves of Grass from the 1891-92 when it was restored after having disappeared from the title pages of Leaves of Grass 1881 and 1883 to 1884. Let's turn now specifically to the text, and let's enjoy ourselves for just a few moments with the very first of the poems, as Whitman is ostensibly welcoming you, the reader, to the text. Come, said my soul, such verses for my body let us write, for we are one, that should I after death invisibly return, or long, long hence in other spheres, there to some group of mates, the chance resuming, tallying earth's soil, trees, winds, tumultuous waves, ever with pleased smile, I may keep on, ever and ever yet, the verses owning. As first, I here and now, signing for soul and body, set to them my name, and then of course the signature of Walt Whitman. Now let's turn for a few moments and just pay attention. And again, my hope is that as you're following these lectures with me, you'll have your own personal copy of Leaves of Grass, Deathbed Edition. My hope is that you're annotating as we go. Let's work through this set of lines now as the introduction and why it works so well. So many of the major themes of Leaves of Grass will be introduced here. Notice, first of all, we'll begin with an invitation. Come, said my soul. Now, go ahead and note in your copy of Leaves of Grass that when Whitman uses this discussion with his soul and himself, immediately we are going to find ourselves in what is sometimes referred to as Whitman's dualisms or Whitman's trinities. That is to say, there's a whole bunch of Whitmans, okay? There is, of course, Whitman, his body. There is, of course, Whitman, his mind. There is, of course, Whitman, his soul. And here, of course, this idea of soul or spirit. By the way, did you notice the second line will utilize this parenthetic, these parentheses, and he'll do this periodically in his poems. Such verses for my body, notice capitalized, let us write. Now, of course, you can't hear this let us write without thinking of things like let us make man in our image, the Genesis 1 creation story. In the back of Whitman's mind, no question, is the beginnings, the Genesis, and he's familiar that most of his readers will know that opening lines of the book of Genesis, the beginnings of it all. And so notice here, he's going to say, let us write. Notice as well that body is capitalized so that we can talk about both physical body or the body that would be the nation. And he'll often use these kinds of languages, words that are part of different languages of identification. And he's going to play that game right here, right now with body, right? And then notice in parentheses, the soul talking to the body, for we are one. Now this idea of bringing together dualisms is something that Whitman is going to play with over and over again as we see it. I'm gonna help you to see it. Whitman is philosopher. He loves to do this kind of thing. Funny, are you one or are you two? Well, I am a body, that's true, but I guess I'm also a mind that's aware that I have a body, so you at least have a mind. Yeah, but as we've said in many lectures, I'm also aware that I can think. Well, if my mind is doing the thinking, then what is it that allows me to be aware of my thinking? Spirit, whatever you want to call it, spirit, soul, whatever you want to call it, consciousness that can see itself, as we learned from our study of Julius Caesar, eyeball can't see itself. So what is that stands behind the mind and allows for you to be aware that the mind is at work? Whitman's going to play all those games. And then the third line, should I after death invisibly return? Now this is of course what we will sometimes call as Whitman as Messiah or the messianic quality. Of course Whitman is Arthur, the once and future king, as we've said it in other lectures at learnstrong.net. This idea of coming back. Whitman was very, very certain, and this makes him an unusual writer. He was some of you will call it cocky, right? He was very certain that long after he was gone, people would continue to read his stuff. And in the moments they read his stuff, he somehow invisibly returned. That's why I'm calling these conversations talks with Walt, because I think it's exactly what he wanted. He wanted us to pick him up. He'll say this and give him hey, what's it feel like to have me in your hands? And you go, whoa, what are you talking about? No, what's it like? He asks, what's it like? Because I know you're going to have me in your hands years and years hence. When we get to crossing Brooklyn Ferry, we'll play this same game out again, right? Or, he says, long, long hence, in the future, in other spheres, which is a great way to say the future, right? There to some group of mates, the chance resuming. Now, notice the word mates here. Whitman was a man of the people. He loved to hang out with normal people. He loved to go down and hang out at the wharf. He loved to talk with what we would today call cab drivers. He loved it. The omnibus drivers. And he would visit them if they were ever injured in hospital. He loved pals. I love the word pals, and of course here mates, that is to say, those who you really want to be with. Notice as well, he says, I might come back, the chance resuming. Now, of course, this is the word C-H-A-N-T-S. Now, of course, that word is songs. And so we're going to point out right away, this is the invocation of the muse. Let's put it in our notes. We've studied enough of our Homer, of our Virgil, of our Milton, to understand what the invocation of the muse means here. And notice, we are already learning that he loves this word chanting, singing, right? We're back to, of course, our study of Beowulf and the great classic, poems that start out, first of all, oral constructions, right? But I also want to point out the word chants, C-H-A-N-T-S, sounds a whole lot like the word chance, C-H-A-N-C. Isn't that interesting? Whitman loves to do this kind of thing, where he plays with language, which is why we often will say that Whitman plays in the fields of language. Then we have another parenthetics. Tallying, that is to say, taking into account, earths, notice it's capitalized, soil, trees, winds, tumultuous waves. By the way, all of these and more are going to be metaphors in this poem, in this collection of poems, in Leaves of Grass. We're going to hear a lot about soil. Got to grow things out of the dirt. You're going to hear a lot about trees. He'll mention it, for example, in Song of the Open Road. What's it? Why is it that sometimes you walk under a tree and it's just so amazing? We'll reference Ruthie's Tree over and over again, planted there many years ago because of our love of this set of poems. Winds, of course, we'll think immediately of Ode to the West Wind and Shelley. You can't read Whitman without your appreciation of Shelley. Tumultuous waves. Of course, the word tumultuous is going to play around with what Whitman knew he was doing. He was definitely stirring it up, to use the lines of Bob Marley. Definitely stirring it up. Another, of course, iconoclast in Bob Marley, just like Walt Whitman. And, of course, the waves, the idea of waves is going to be really central to our study of Leaves of Grass. Ever with pleased smile. By the way, notice the spelling of the word pleased where he drops the E. So he's going to give you this kind of colloquial word, pleased smile. I may keep on. Now, the idea of the smile is really important. Whitman is a poet of truth. That is to say, he's going to bring the pain of the world, the suffering of the world, and also the joy of the world. And so we're going to have a lot of smiling in this text. And it seems to me in a time like this in our nation's history, we need a little bit of smiling, don't we? So I hope that as you read Whitman's Leaves of Grass, you can appreciate both sides of his poetry. Ever and ever. Notice how he likes this repetition of a word like long, long hence. Ever and ever yet, the verses owning. Now this idea of owning his stuff is fascinating because when he published this original set of poems in 1855, didn't have his name on the front, didn't sign his name on the front, didn't even have a table of contents, he didn't even have titles for the poems. He had a picture of himself standing looking much different than most people were going to own their poetry. He had a picture with his shirt undone, a hat on his head cocked a certain way. We'll get to that set of lines and the way in which he edited it later, but the idea that I can wear my hat any way I want, it was a defiant pose. I want you to Google it and take a look at the original face piece, the artwork that attended the 1855 edition. Here, notice he says, I'm always going to own these verses, which is interesting because at times he would not own necessarily everything that he did. So kind of fascinating use of this word. And then notice the dash. We'll think of Emily Dickinson. How many times we're going to mention her, what we say it in 303, precious name, right? She is a precious poet to us, as is Whitman. The use of the dash. It's almost as, oh yeah, I got one more thing. Oh yeah, I got one. You know how we do that when we talk? It's going to be very similar. As first, I hear and now, and circle the word now, because it's constant in this poem, in this set of poems. I'm going to call Leaves of Grass a poem, even though I understand it's a book. I'll call it a lot of things. Whitman called it himself. He called it the nation. He called it an epic. I mean, he called it a lot of things. And then we're back to the word singing. Well, of course, maybe one of the most famous poems in all of Leaves of Grass, I hear America singing the varied carols I hear. This notion of singing, now we're going to capitalize both the S and the B for soul and body. Set to them my name. Walt Whitman. Now, no one will debate that he was a bit of an aggrandizer, self-promoter, and here, of course, we're going to finish with, okay, I'm ready to put my name to this collection of poetry. Well, at 2A, in terms of messages, themes, we said it already. The invocation of the muse, as well as the invitation to sing. I hope that is what our study together will provide you. Whitman said, I need my poems to be read aloud. Opera was a huge part of the influences on him, which is why, of course, we often play opera in 303 as a tribute to Whitman. At 2B, again, we pointed out already the use of the parenthetics, the use of the dash, not what he says, but how he says it. At 3A, well, how are we going to relate this to other texts? Well, of course, Homer will say it as Sing, O Goddess, the rage of Achilles. We've given full lectures, of course, on the Iliad, as well as the Odyssey. Think about Virgil's opening lines of arms and the man I sing. Whitman was acutely aware that he was playing a very similar game when he was providing us with the opening lines here. Think about Longfellow, Whitman's contemporary. Psalm of life, as in song of life. Tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream, for the soul is dead that slumbers and things are not what they seem. Notice here right away, we got Whitman playing a very similar game. Finally at 3B, we always try to relate, right, back to ourselves. What is your favorite song? Like, for example, what's the last one you hope you get to be listening to when you finally have to leave the park and you can no longer swing and you got to go to the van that's been waiting for you the whole time? Well, Whitman will say it that way often. I'm waiting. I hope that you'll continue our talks with Walt as we come back then to look at the first collection of poems, Inscriptions. Thank you.